Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure to have you here today for our public lecture. My name is Stefan Winners. I'm on the board of Hubert Media, in charge for our digital business. Many companies you might know from the brands. We operate the majority of Zing. I hope you all have a Zing account. We operate Tomorrow Focus, which has brands like Holiday Check, Elite Partners. So every one of you who wants a matching partner for his life, please go to Elite Partner if you want to go on Holiday Check for your trip. It's very nice if you do that. And it's a great pleasure you're here today for our public lecture. At the moment we have our DLD conference here in Munich with over 800 people attending. 80% are women. It's one of the very few conferences here in Europe where we do that to bring in high talented, very professional women to talk about technology and modern trends. And it's a great pleasure today to have Sonali here with us.
Thank you.
Sonali and I know us for 4 years. I think we have met 4 years ago. And I remember when we met, I never told you, Sonali, when we met in your London office. I went to Paul and said, we have to get that company, the woman in our company after our meeting, when you already worked for ACCEL.
Well, this was a way to do it, so.
Definitely, and it's great that you're here today on our conference at the talk. You have been born in Mumbai, and you have a degree from Harvard Business School, and as you told me, you have worked for Goldman Sachs, and you got a fantastic training there. And you are now in your 13th year of venture capitalist. You have invested into many companies, and it's a great pleasure to have you here today to talk about venture capitalism, internet companies, and also about your experience of a very ambitious mother of 2 kids, 3 and 6 years old, how to combine your life. And please give Sonali a warm applause if you're here today.
Thank you.
So let's start. I've prepared some questions to you. What does it take to do your job every day? What kind of characteristics, what do you need to be successful in venture capitalism?
Absolutely, but before I answer that, I just want to say, enjoy being in that seat. It's fantastic to be a student of any ilk, of any measure, and I just want to say that I miss my days when I could sit at the back of the classroom and listen to people like myself. So I just want to say enjoy it. It's fantastic out there, but it's also fantastic in here. So I don't know if it's the same as in the US as it's here, but it's wonderful to be here. Thank you very much for hosting me. So what does it take? Well, it's in our business, you're more wrong than you're right. And that's what the business model is. We're in a hits-driven business, investing in venture capital and technology. It's about the companies that end up being very large, very substantial, very durable, that end up paying for all the businesses that ended up not doing so well. So you only have to be right a few times, but mathematically you're wrong all the time. So one of the characteristics is waking up in the morning and thinking, okay, you were kind of wrong here, you were kind of wrong here, you were actually wrong on that one too, because you never thought it would get so big. So you learn to live with failure in a different way. But it's really about being patient and thinking very long term. So we invest in markets that are often just starting to triple, and it's not obvious what the market timing will be. We invest in teams. I think my last handful of entrepreneurs were 25 years old, and they don't have a track record. So we invest in, there's a lot of risk. So you have to be comfortable with risk. You have to be comfortable with being wrong every single day, even on the upside. And you have to be comfortable with uncertainty, but it's a lot of fun.
So when you say you have to take a lot of risk, when you look back at the last 13 years, how many companies have you invested approximately?
Okay, that was a trick question. I should have done the math before I came here. So I probably invested, call it 10, 12. So not a lot, Each person only does a couple of investments a year. And when I was young, I was not allowed the checkbook, probably for good reason. So probably around 10.
And how many of those 10 have become blockbusters?
Well, in our world,
10 times
we don't
money
call
back.
it. So it's always on, we think about valuations in a realized and unrealized way. So only when a company is public and you can see the stock price and you can multiply by the market cap, and the money's in your bank, do you really think it's a blockbuster? But certainly what I can say is a number of those companies have ended up having, revenues that are hundreds more than when we invested. So businesses that were nothing and are lending, or in the case of a company called Wonga that are lending billions, and when we invested, they were lending close to nothing. So there are different metrics of Spotify, which was very small in terms of user base and now has a very engaged global audience, or businesses in the classified that only had a few million visitors listing a few million things, and now there's tens of millions of commerce being transacted. So there are other metrics. So I've been lucky enough to be behind some businesses that have really grown very well, and I've been also very lucky to have learned from my fair share of companies that went completely not according to plan. Completely not according to plan.
And if you look at those 10 companies you invested, how many are dead today, haven't been successful? 2 or 3?
There are 2 or 3. They haven't died yet. Okay. So I think it's a bit unfair if the entrepreneur reads about it in the press before,
so they are all alive?
Some, in the early days I probably invested in companies that I was probably more risk averse. And I would say more recently there are definitely companies that are, on their way to not doing so well. But that's really the art of venture capital. The art of venture capital is not about making the first investment. It is very easy to be convinced. It is very easy to make the first investment. And you should. We're in the investing business. We're about taking risks. We're about investing in the most unlikely entrepreneurs and in spaces that we're not sure when market timing will hit. But really what it is about is saying, after the first capital in, if it doesn't work, it's the right thing for the industry. It's the healthy thing to say, no more capital. And I think one of the biggest changes I've seen in venture capital over the last sort of 13 years, which is a very long time, in Europe, is that finally entrepreneurs themselves are picking up their hand and saying, this is not working, I'm going to go do my next thing. Because now entrepreneurship is actually a job. It's not a one-time wonder, which is just a phenomenal thing to sort of see. This virtuous cycle that we talked about, that the US knows so well in Silicon Valley and in other markets, but especially Silicon Valley, is finally happening here. The concept of serial entrepreneurship is here to stay. Yeah.
Before we talk about teams and entrepreneurship, which is definitely probably one of the most important things you said, what else? What kind of criteria do you have once you invest? You said markets very early. What else? How do you decide out of the hundreds of companies being started where to go into?
Yeah, so we see thousands of business plans and ideas, and we invest in a handful of companies. So clearly there's a lot of things that we say no to. And one of the biggest issues that we have with especially first-time management teams, who keep emailing me back or emailing one of my colleagues and say, no, you don't understand, we're going to be big. And the truth is that we're very limited. Our model of venture capitalists, who are very much Silicon styled, been active in venture investing for 30 years, our model is hits driven. We manage fund sizes that are 400 or 500 million. And for us, if you think about it, for a company to really make an impact, it has to be worth 5, 6, 7, 800, $1 billion, maybe more. The truth is there's not that many multi-billion-dollar companies. We've been lucky enough to be behind a good few, but there aren't that many. So you have to really think, will this business be worth $500 million? 10 years, 12 years, 5 years, it doesn't really matter that much because we're not measured as much on IRR, as much on cash on cash, because in the end, the markets work so that the IRR also works in the asset class. But we'll come back to that. I have no doubt you'll quiz me on that. I can feel it coming. But more realistically, it's really about, can a business be this large? And the truth is, if you really think about it, there are very few businesses who can actually be that large. And that's where we trip up the most. And it's the worst thing for an entrepreneur to hear, that you're going to be small. So we keep saying, you know what, you'll be big, you'll make money for yourself, you'll make money for your investors, but maybe you don't need our kind of capital that forces you to be big. In fact, maybe that's unnatural. Start small. On your next entrepreneurship journey, come and find us. So that's probably the biggest thing we focus on. How big can it be if it all goes well? Because if it all goes well and you can't be big, and you think that the day you invest, it'll never be big.
Sonali, how important are certain angel investors for you? So Reid Hoffman has been very successful in investing into a lot of companies, and Hubert as well. Is that for you something where you say they are invested, I have a look what they're doing? How important is that for you?
Europe is funky from that perspective. We don't have this micro VC phenomena that you have in the US, where you have repeat entrepreneurs who've set up smaller funds, who are very accomplished individuals, accomplished networks, great insight, and really operating as mini VCs. And one of the reasons that doesn't exist is because you don't often have small companies being bought by the obvious buyers like Google or eBay, PayPal, Amazon. You don't have the frequency of what I would call small to medium-sized companies, 10, 30 million, which is a way to recycle capital in angel networks in the US. You don't have that in Europe because typically those tend to be acqui-hires, talent acquisitions, that's the terminology, acquisition for hiring people really, and you don't tend to do that in a new geography versus where your sort of center of product and R&D is. So because of that, you don't have the market, the depth of the angel network as much as you have in the US. And so you know what, we've had to rely on ourselves because it's never about the first stage of funding, it's about the second and the third. And angel networks don't have the deep pockets to sustain a company to get to the point where it starts to show real traction. So we've had to do the early stage and the growth stage. And that's why we call ourselves stage agnostic. Majority of our business is early stage, but we really do think of ourselves as stage agnostic in order to actually propel the European ecosystem. So not as much as in the US.
Okay. And if you look for larger investment, which you do in growth companies, and we talk about larger checks of 10 million plus, are you doing any due diligence? Or my question, how important is technology for you? Are you looking into the technology, how sustainable the team is? Are you using any diagnostic systems? How do you make a judgment whether the company is the right one to put
it's a great question. So our average investment actually, if you just do an average, which it never ends up being like this, is probably around 15 million. So, we do end up making our first investment, which will be maybe 5 to 8, and then we follow it up. We really back our winners. So if you look, there's a concentration of capital within a fund in the companies that are doing well, and that's how we manage to drive every dollar of return for our investors. We do a lot of diligence. We do a ton of diligence because then there's always a reason to say no, by the way. So it ends up being quite a interesting outcome when you see all the facts, and nothing is perfect. In fact, everything is far from perfect. So it's really about judgment. And the technology side, I have to say it is a great question because on one hand you think, well, if you have hundreds of thousands of customers or you're selling product and it's working and the site hasn't broken down, then you know what, it's probably not an area of risk. That said, one of the biggest issues we've seen in companies that flatten, and these are some of the best companies that you probably don't even know about. I mean, whether it's a Skype, whether it's companies that in our portfolio that we won't discuss, which are mega successes, they've all had their period of technology blip, a technology legacy. And so I think we should do more to answer your question. But genuinely speaking, there's so much risk in these companies that we focus much more around, is the product going to continue to sell? Is the team, does it have what it takes for them to go another 5 years? Because when we start, the transaction is the beginning of the journey. I mean, it's like the easiest bit is to invest. Yeah. It's the next 5 to 10 years. And if the team is not aligned, that's the kind of stuff we focus on, but we should probably do more in tech. Okay. Is there any X factor in your investment, something which is not rational, where you say, I just want to do that investment because? It's a great question. Is it all very rational, that you go through the metrics, you have your interviews, you see the people, you do due diligence? Is there an X factor somewhere? No. It's so much, there's so much about the gut, the stomach. It is, and the gut is really trained. The thing about venture capital, and it's fascinating if you go to a technology company and you see it grow, and you choose to become an entrepreneur, which I think is a journey of itself, and one that probably trains you better than anything to do everything you want to do in life, in my honest opinion. I should have done it, but it's too late now, clearly. But in any event, I think that the gut, the pattern recognition that you get from having seen a movie. I mean, really, if you think about what an experienced investor is, they're a group of people who've seen every version of the story. So we've been around for 30 years, we have 10 billion under management, we've invested in hundreds of companies, more than a couple of hundred have actually either gone public or gotten sold. We've seen that version of facts. We've seen the pothole, we've seen the wall, we've seen entrepreneurs and management teams drive into the wall. And so really, it's the pattern recognition, it's the tuning of the gut. that actually we rely on. So not just plain gut, because you can be very wrong. I remember my first meeting, my first ever venture capital meeting. I saw this company that was doing something in semantic search. This was before Google. And I thought, wow, this is incredible. Oh my God, I'm so lucky that my first meeting I had a chance to be behind the next big business. And I walked out of the meeting, and my bosses said, well, what do you think? And I sort of spouted lyrical about how incredible it was. And they were like, that was the worst company we've seen in a long time. That was the shittiest presentation. I was like, shit, I thought I was smart. I know nothing. And that's really what this business is about. It's about experience. It's about being an apprentice. It's about learning, tuning your gut, and then actually having the confidence to rely on your gut, even though your gut's clearly been wrong, as I said, more often than right. So.
Okay. So if we can now talk a bit about your investments.
Yes.
And let's
I thought
talk.
we already did that. But
yeah,
okay.
I know. I would like to go deeper in it. The question is there, which deal didn't you get?
Yes.
Which you would like to have actually done?
You know, we're lucky, and I'm going to not do an advertisement, but ACCEL is a very well-regarded global institution, been behind, very lucky to have been behind some massive successes. So, and beyond that, this business is cumulative, and I think I hopefully have talked about that. So a combination of our Silicon Valley heritage, our network, insights, this is really what you look for in a good investor, and then the brand. It makes us pretty formidable. But I have said no to some great companies. So let me turn the question around and say, we have been in a position to get, we may have here and there, but in terms of what the mistakes we've made, in our business, it's, as I said, it's not about what you do, it's about what you don't do that plagues you. It's the anti-portfolio, that you had a chance to actually do that, the people who passed on Google, and there are many stories like that in all our
is there
collective.
anything? Is there a company
well,
you said no, which is now a huge company?
A German business that I spend a lot of time with, and I think is a great team, is SoundCloud. And I was trying to, in the very early stage, it was how the rap artists were discussing their new songs with their fans. It was how people were storing music. There were copyright issues. And I remember talking to Alexander and thinking, but what are you? Are you a collaboration platform? Are you a kind of a sort of Dropbox for the music industry? Are you for the labels? And I got so confused as to what it would be that I actually just didn't see the real market momentum. I mean, even though it was at a very, I'm paid to sort of see this at a small level, because when it's obvious, it's too late, right? When you read about it in the FT or the BBC. So that was a company where it was a good team, some very interesting product, real product talent, real innovation around design and user interface, and I got stuck up on, because music is a tough industry, and I got sort of stuck in all of the pattern recognition of why not to invest. So that's something that I regret, and I tell him that every time I see him, and he enjoys me hearing that. And I'm sure he'll enjoy reading about this perhaps. So that's an example of a great German business.
So if we now look into the future, the next 5 years, what are for you the big investment areas where you should go to, where you should look to, where the big things are?
We discussed this briefly in the car. I think that a lot of the evolutionary businesses are being done and have been done. So, we've done really well in marketplaces, taking things that didn't exist before, allowing new forms of user behavior. So we have a company called Halo, which is a taxi application, which I think you hail a taxi every 4 seconds, and that really takes advantage of the mobile, about GPS, about location, and I think that that wasn't possible on the web because you didn't stand around with your PC trying to hail a taxi. So what we've seen a lot of, and I think they're fascinating, is new forms of behavior that get enabled with new form factors and with just the consumerization of the web that you would never have seen before, around people sharing their homes, sharing their cars, sharing their clothes, and developing very vibrant new economies. And I think of that as fascinating, but as an evolution. If I have to look long term and really far out, I tell you that the areas of finance and banking and education are truly going to be disrupted, and we're very much at ground zero around that. If you think about why do you transact, and I hope this won't come back to bite me, but why do you transact with the bank? Is it because you trust them? I mean, I don't know, not really. Is it because you're getting the best rate from a savings perspective? Probably not. Is it because you're learning something? Are you sort of feeling like you're helping people? Definitely not. So the question is why, what role does a bank, which is omnipotent, what role does a bank have in your life in the next sort of 10, 15 years from either a borrowing perspective or a lending perspective or a savings perspective even. And I think we're already seeing innovations around next generation lending that take, Wonga as an example, that take a completely new approach to what is a good credit? Why are you a good credit? It's not because you could be a good credit. It's not about whether you can pay back. It's about whether you will pay back. And that's behavioral. So I think what we're seeing is taking behavioral data, taking a lot of information that's out there, and really applying a new layer of utility and ubiquity and mobility to disrupt the way people interact with banks, for example. Over time, in my view, education won't go there over here. But, and I think, the best schools and institutions are driving that. They're behind the change. And I think these are big, long-term sectoral shifts that we've just started to see sort of the impact on.
There you have an eye on. So Sonali, if we talk about finance for a second, I mean, we have seen a lot of regulation recently there in finance. And if you see your perspective as a VC, going into a market which is now starting, as you said, at the very first beginning, how do you handle the fact that we might have some governments who just stop you doing some business because of protection of the customers? How do you include that in your model?
I live with this, so this is a very good question. So, I go back to the fact that we are paid to take risk. Now, you can argue that we take risks on markets, and we take risk on teams, and we take risk on product and pricing. So do you really want to take risk on regulatory? And the answer is no. So we really have to believe in the consumer proposition. So we really have to believe that you're bringing transparency, utility, and actually a new form of product that just wasn't possible before. So you're allowing somebody to invest in an entrepreneur in Bangladesh, and actually they're making a return on that, and you're allowing a business. So it has to be that what you're doing is so disruptive and so new that regulators will have to take notice. Now, is it possible that regulators will shut you down? Well, it's entirely possible, and we're seeing it every single day. So I think that's a risk we have to live with. But we live in the business of backing global businesses. So hopefully there's not just a single country risk, because regulation is local, but there's really a platform that you can build at a global level where an aggregate with the right entrepreneur and the right opportunity is going to work in your favor.
So even if you have some area which drops out because of regulation, you have a global
hopefully
space
can build a
because
portfolio.
the technology is
and this
running.
is where we look for the next 10 years. Yeah, you can build a portfolio.
Okay. So before we dig deeper into entrepreneurship, VC in general, let's talk about you as a wife with 2 kids.
Yes.
You told me your kids are 3 and 6 years old.
Yes.
How do you handle that? How many hours are you working as a VC on average? How do you handle your kids? How are you making that possible to handle both?
Well, the first answer is I don't really handle it. I do the 80-20 thing, which means nothing is ever perfect, but you live with imperfection and uncertainty. So, from a practical perspective, I have an entrepreneur husband, so there's some very interesting discussions. I can never give him feedback at home. It's fascinating. I always have to sort of find other ways. But beyond that dynamic, he sometimes is more flexible than me. There are times when he's not, and I have to sort of make it work. So we kind of do, every week is a challenge. Every week is like a scheduling diary. And so we kind of figure out how to do it. But more than that, it really keeps you real. I think that no matter how many tens of millions you have invested in a company that may be going through a tough time, when you come home and your daughter talks about the fight that she had at school, it really sort of keeps you real. And I think that it's a balance that's tough to do. And by the way, nothing good is not tough, but entirely possible for all the women here who want to have successful careers. I think it's a prerogative to do that. It's a privilege and a prerogative. And once you manage to do some sort of balance, it's never perfect, then it feels pretty good. I have to tell you, it feels pretty good.
Great.
And they're very cute. And they don't care at all what I do. But I'll give you a little anecdote, not that you asked. I was in this really silly there's a financial news. It really doesn't mean much, but it was a newspaper, and maybe this is something you're used to, given your role in Germany. But it was a financial paper, and for some reason it was in my bag, and my daughter saw it. She had no idea what financial news is. She just thought her mother was in the paper. Honestly, I wasn't even going to tell her about it. She was so thrilled to see the picture, but how did you get on the paper? Because she just couldn't understand it. I mean, she's 6 years old, and for her, she went and told her friends about it. Meanwhile, she's in the class with sort of Stella McCartney, so other people's mothers are also in the paper all the time. So it wasn't a competition. But the thrill that she got to see that I was in the paper was actually worth probably all the hard work in the 6 months before. Not the years before that, but the 6 months. Anyway, interesting anecdote for me at least.
But you try to keep weekends off working, or are you working on the weekends as well sometimes?
You know, the great thing is that at the end of the day, you back entrepreneurs who call you, you step out, you do a call, but I'm really
flexible.
Very flexible. The children, when they need me, I'm absolutely always there. I work in I'm actually lucky that I don't have to deal with a lot of the issues that women in corporations have to deal with, just because it's a small team. We're a team of about 12 investment professionals in London. And you know what, we don't have any, it's really about who you are as a person, because when it's so small, it's very easy to figure it all out. So I'm very privileged in the group that work with me and support me, and including my entrepreneurs who very much understand the needs of balancing a family. So I consider myself very, very, very lucky and quite unique in that ability to manage it all. So
great. A question, I mean, you can deny to answer that question, it's okay, but you have been very successful. What is your greatest weakness you have, which makes problems in your business?
You know, I still don't suspend disbelief enough. So I don't know whether this is a phrase that people understand, where if someone tells me something and something's clearly not working, but I always say, but what's the narrative? What's the entrepreneur's narrative? What's the story they're telling as to why it's not working? And part of me sometimes believes them, even though it's the third time. So luckily I have a very paranoid side of me, and that's maybe being kind of the immigrant and growing up in India and kind of having to do a lot with myself. So I do shut it down sometimes, but there's this part of, I think it's being a woman, being empathetic, but like, well, that's a great story, maybe it's true. And by the way, in our business, you really have to look at the facts. After a while, you have to look at the facts, especially if you've been in a journey for a long time. So sometimes I don't suspend disbelief as much as I would, and I kind of like hearing the story, and I believe in change, and people don't change. So,
if you look at ACCEL, at your companies, how many other female partners do you have on the GP level?
So actually we're okay, because there's only a handful of GPs, so as a percentage we're doing very well. And so we have in the Valley, we have Teresa Gauranzetta, who was actually one of the reasons I joined, and was one of the great attractions. And so we're actually probably, and we've had no legal, we've had, there's lots of other, there's been a lot of noise in the industry. Yeah, we haven't had it quite the opposite. I mean, we're extremely collegiate. So we're actually okay. But, the real question is around the women entrepreneurs. I mean, I think if I have to think about where our focus should be, it's not really in VC, because VC is what you do at the end of a career in many ways. And I think it attracts the successful people, whether they're men or whether they're women. And it's about the qualities. We talked a lot about that at DLDwomen. And if you haven't read Athena Doctrine, I would read it. It's all about what are female qualities in leadership, what are male qualities. And leadership applies to anything that you may or may not do. But really, to me, it's about how do you develop women entrepreneurs, because it is tough to be an entrepreneur. I've talked about this before, but entrepreneurship is a fascinating journey. It prepares you for everything and anything you'll ever do in life. It makes you so confident, and it doesn't matter when you start, but the earlier you start, I think the better off you are in life, and you should take that risk to do it early as opposed to later. But it is tough to do it at some point as a woman, especially if you want to have a family, because with entrepreneurship you give it your all. That's why I encourage women to do it even earlier in their lives, and I think that's one of the reasons we don't have that many women entrepreneurs in Europe, is because people get to it in their 30s, and that's almost at the time when you're making decisions around family, and the opportunity cost is very, very high.
But Sonali, isn't it also because if we look at the number of female students coming out of universities, especially for engineering,
yes,
for the subject, which many of your founders actually have studied before,
yes,
that the ratio there is still 20% female studying engineering?
Yeah, and it used to be even worse than that. So,
even worse, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's climbed up to 20%. So, and maybe it's, a little bit more depending on the university in question. I think Stanford has done some great leaps even in the last 2-3 years around technical grads. But yeah, it is very low. Is your question why, or what can we do to change that?
Actually, it is probably one of the part of the reasons. And the question here would be, should everyone should everyone do a few semesters of coding and engineering to bring additional value and knowledge to their profiles to have a more flexible development later?
It's fascinating actually. If you see the statistics, that the class of computer science graduates and coders actually peaked in terms of women and men in the 80s. So in the 70s and 80s, you had a much more balance, and then something happened, and then you have it kind of climbing back up again. So the question is kind of what happened? And I think what happened was a lot of the innovation was really just pure engineering driven. It wasn't touching the consumer. It was really around the infrastructure, the plumbing, not a bad thing, a fascinating thing, but not necessarily attracting women who had a more multi-dimensional disciplinary experience. And what I mean by that is what I've seen is with the advent of design and consumer innovation and innovation around kind of consumers as global citizens, you're seeing a lot more women who've actually been trained in FMCG and in marketing and in design coming to technology and having a major impact because they got trained in the more classical sense, but then they learned that product marketing and they sort of applied that to technology, because in many ways a lot of the consumer goods that we all use are just consumer goods. They just happen to be delivered over your mobile, over the internet. And so the fundamental shift of the innovations in technology that have become at least as much consumer-centric over the last sort of decade, and who knows what's going to happen in the next decade, I think has brought out the ability for women to really have an impact at senior levels. Mm-hmm. And this is like anything, it's about role models. So the more senior women you have, the more the famous trickle-down effect, the more impact they have, the more the next generation. You have to have role models within a business and within technology. I think technology very much lags the entire industry, but my view is that that's a backward-looking statistics. It'll change. The way, hopefully, we'll get back to the way it was in sort of, almost 30 years ago.
Okay. Before we continue on entrepreneurship, shall we throw 3 questions to the crowd? Who would like to ask any questions? That's the first hand. I love it. Thank you very much. Please.
We are, and the question was asked, which will be in 10 years the field where you see the future for innovative startups, and it was mentioned finance, we were quite detailed on education. But I'm very interested to know about your ideas about education.
So for everyone who didn't deep dive into education, what's going on there?
It's a tough one, right? Because it's a lot about history. I mean, how old is this institution? Maybe this building is more than 100 years old, right? So
I have to ask, more than 100 years?
I'm more or less correct, right? Approximation is the name of the game. The question is how do you take institutional history and how do you replace that, if you will, with technology? And so where we've seen real innovation has been almost at sort of the next generation of personalization. So the thing that you can't do in a physical context is really to personalize a lecture for a class of 100. And so one of the companies that we've invested in, which has made real strides around just taking core technology and plumbing that can then be applied to coursework, is doing adaptive learning to the nth degree. So based on my skill level, based on my talent level, based on my objectives, what is my curriculum, and is that going to be fundamentally different from your curriculum to really take advantage of personalization and culture and all the things that we know very well. So, we're more focused on the infrastructure than the next online university per se, or the next marketplace, though I think these are interesting concepts. That's what I think will really revolutionize how learning is not just delivered, but how the actual content is changed.
Do you have 2 or 3 companies you are looking at?
Well, the company that we talk a lot about is a New York-based company called Newton that we invested in when actually it started out doing adaptive learning for GMATs and LSATs and SATs, etc. And that's how it sort of learned and realized that the impact was far greater than that. And it pivoted from just being a consumer business where people took these classes and then did the actual score, and of course they did much better, but actually going to the big publishers and saying, let me revolutionize your content so you can then use my platform to be much more scalable, much more global, and much more digital. So that's a company that we talk about in this context.
There was another question just here. There's a microphone behind you.
Is there a best place to start a company? And if there is a best place, where do you think it is?
So, the most interesting phenomena, I think, of these times in technology and innovation is that a great company can start literally anywhere, and I mean anywhere. There is no monopoly on innovation in the Valley at all. There never has been. but there has been a monopoly on just, the building the great businesses that we all know and that are household names. And that's because you have Amazon Web Services now. Bandwidth costs are very cheap. In 2000 to launch a site would cost you tens of thousands of dollars a month, and now it barely costs you a few thousand to launch something that is actually at scale. You have open source software. So in our view, the way we think about it is, when we travel from places from Minsk to Lithuania has been a very active, Vilnius, who would imagine, to Istanbul. I'm off to Moscow tomorrow. So really, companies can start anywhere, people can start anywhere. The question is, how do you get to critical mass? Beyond the point at which you can get a product out and you know it's working, etc., how do you attract the next 20 people? I think you can, even get to the first 20. How do you attract the next 20 and the next 50 and the 100? Then it really does make sense to be closer to the commercial talent that you need, because I think R&D can almost be anywhere, and people scale technology teams in a very virtual sense these days. In fact, that's a norm. And then you have to think, is your market in the US? If you are starting a software business, and I think Munich has always been a great bastion for great enterprise businesses, then you know what? Maybe being in the US is actually not a bad idea. It's where standards are set, it's where the partnerships are, it's where the big market is, the homogenous market. Or is it being in financial services, then maybe being London is there, or being in Berlin for other kinds of consumer services. So the answer is there's no right answer, but a company can start anywhere, but you have to think about, are you building a long-term durable business, in which case being closer to the commercial talent is a must, and closer to the end customer.
Yeah, let me just share some information.
Sure, I couldn't agree more.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, we have Holiday Check, which is near Lake Constance in Constance, and we have probably 25 open positions for engineers, which we can't find because Google is in Zurich and they take all the Swiss away, and that's a very big challenge. And if you have a choice, if I would be answering the question, I would just say, just start in a larger city. So go to Munich, Cologne, Hamburg, or Berlin. Berlin is now becoming very expensive for engineers because they all can work part-time and they earn 90,000 a year. It's rather cheaper here in Munich to start a company to get engineers because Berlin is overheated. So if you have a great idea, just give me a phone call, okay?
Yeah.
Or Sonali.
Or me, for that matter. But I'll tell you, the Valley is going through its biggest talent crunch in a very long time. You just can't keep people at the minute. So people talk about, well, I'm going to move to the US, and I'd say, why? You're going to be a nobody there. Better be in your own home market and really figure out. And yes, I agree with Stefan to go to a bigger city, just because you want to be able to scale. You don't want to have friction in hiring for the first 20.
But then the problem starts.
Or the opportunity.
I know.
You talked a bit about gut feeling, and
yes.
By definition, gut feeling is hard to put into words.
Yes.
If you did, how do you recognize a great team?
It is a very, very good question, and I always say to my partners when I decide not to invest in something, I talk about the fact that I didn't get any insight. When a great entrepreneur has a very specific way to describe a market or market timing, they'll come up with insights that you've never heard before. It's like when you read a good book, you think, aha, I never thought about it like that. Or when you hear a great TED talk, or when you hear this fantastic public lecture, you think, I never thought about it like that. That was a joke, by the way. But, and that's what a great entrepreneur has. He has insights into his space that you've never heard before, and that makes you think that they think differently. So that's one. The insight that you hear, because that's very practical. You can hear that in a one-hour pitch. You can see someone selling fashion e-commerce, and there's hundreds of them. And then you think, that's something I've never sort of heard before, and that's how the person thinks. The second one is you ask whether they'll be able to be a magnet for talent, because without talent, you're nobody. If you're no single man, being a single man show never scales, it never works, especially if you're in a business for 10 years. So do you think these people will be able to attract other people? And so do they have the gravitas, the charisma, the leadership? And maybe that's superficial, but by the way, it really, really helps. And the third one is what motivates them. So if someone's motivated for their own kind of either financial ambition, it never works. It's really about having an impact, because the journey you go through, everything that goes up comes down, and everything that comes down could have a chance of going up. And you really need somebody that's very gritty and that really is doing it for the passion and for the impact, as opposed to for kind of a monetary outcome if it works, etc. So those are some of the attributes.
Before we continue to your question, I have seen you, just some questions about VC in general. So Sonali, many VC funds haven't been very successful. If we look to the reports which we get, especially in Europe, VC business is very tough. Most of them don't bring, what can I say, the return is 3.3% until 2011. If we look to data return, which is nothing, you could put your money on stock markets, you had 12%. What is the reason that the VC industry in Europe is not picking up compared to the rates which you have seen in America, where 3 or 4 companies, and also ACCEL, has been very successful? What is the reason that the overall industry is such in a bad shape?
Yeah, so I mean, a few things about the numbers. The venture industry is really, you need diversification as a limited partner. These are investors in our funds, but you also need concentration. And what I mean by that is that it is a cumulative business where the best entrepreneurs go to the venture fund that has had the big success stories, and then they create the next success stories, and the next entrepreneurs come. So it's kind of unfair. The network effects in this business are substantial. And as a result, it's really always about the top decile and about the top quartile and not about the average. The average in this asset class is uninteresting. It always has been. And it's really about the top decile. And I would argue that if you look over the last 20, 25 years, and these are the numbers supported, if you look at the Cambridge Associates data, the long-term returns of venture capital outperform all other asset classes and definitely outperform kind of the Russell 2000 and Dow Jones Industrial Average, etc. And it's because if you take disproportionate risk, hopefully it should pay off in the long term. So that's one point around the decile is always different, and actually the returns over a longer period have been quite positive. The issue is the last 10 years have been very, very tough. And the reason they've been tough is that you had a glut of capital, you had too much capital chasing very few companies because there's a lag effect in venture capital. So it looks kind of tough, but it takes a long time for the funds to shut down, for the underperformers to not be able to raise the next fund, for people to change their investment strategy and not fund the 4th company that's doing the exact same thing in this sort of small market. And so what we had was overfunding of capital, too much competition for very few great companies, or fewer great companies proportionally. And my view is that since 07, 08, it's kind of cleaned up. And the next cycle, this current cycle, is going to be very interesting. So maybe we've lost a few years, but really investors invest in asset class or venture capital for the long term, and then for the fact that the top decile does perform, and for the outsized return. It's the only, I believe it's the only asset class where you still have certain funds that are double digit at the fund level. I'm not talking about one deal that sort of, you still have, you know, funds that you put in $1 and you make more than 10 times. And it doesn't happen often, but they don't want to miss that one time that it happens.
What separates successful VC firms from the rest?
Maybe that was a...
That was the separation of successful businesses.
That was a hint of something. But so, you know, I've talked about a business being cumulative, and I think having a very, very long track record and being in a business a very long time is
crucial for
necessity and sufficient. I mean, it's really, it is the only way to do this business. It is, I should say it's not sufficient, but it's very, very, very necessary. It's table stakes. So I'm not to say that some great businesses and great firms like Andreessen Horowitz, who, you know, been in the industry a long time, didn't exist as a fund, you know, a few years ago. But generally speaking, and they really are the exception, whether it's us or it's Sequoia or it's Kleiner, that was probably one of the first, seeing the cycles, having the network, having the insights to be able to help, because that's all we do. We're really the people behind the people. The entrepreneurs do all the hard work. We're just the guys who are lucky to sit behind and, you know, hopefully help them give some shortcuts when they need it around talent and recruiting or discussions around strategy. And so the long track record and the ability to have been in business and seen it all before is crucial, to use your terminology. The second one is really to have domain experience, because if you haven't invested in e-commerce, and you're going to know this, right? If you haven't invested in a travel company, then it all looks great, but it's only when you've had the scars that you think, I've seen this before.
Absolutely.
This is, you know, we have a blueprint. We invest with a prepared mind approach. And what we mean by that is it's the founders of ACCEL, when they started the firm, they believed that actually you should have a prepared mind before you hear an entrepreneur. You shouldn't just be reactive, but it's the Louis Pasteur phrase which says chance favors a prepared mind. So yeah, this business is about luck, but you got to be at the table to have luck come to you, which means you got to be prepared, you got to be thoughtful, you got to have domain experience, you got to think about what is the blueprint to succeed in a next generation mobile company or a next generation travel company. Because if you just think it looks interesting, it really is too superficial. So being very deep and being very prepared, that's the second thing. And the third thing is our view, and this is where we're very unique, we think that you have to be global. We talked about starting a company anywhere, we talked about not having a Silicon Valley, not having a monopoly on innovation, but that really is what we believe. You know, we started London 13 years ago, we started China in 2005, India in 2008. It's not easy scaling venture capital, BCG or McKinsey or Goldman Sachs. It's kind of the nature of their business to have global corporates. Venture capital, when you're 10 people around a room thinking, will you invest in that entrepreneur? Why do you want to be in another geography or a geography many miles ago? It's because we take the commitment to be global because we think the best entrepreneurs want to understand what's happening on the global radar screen. And we are better investors because we see what's happening in China and in India. And by the way, there's so many links as to what's happening in India and Russia. I see this all the time.
How do you connect your portfolio companies to make that knowledge transparent in your whole organization?
The best entrepreneurs, they chase us for the connections.
Okay.
So we don't have to do much. Like they chase us incessantly. Well, what about this? You mentioned, that. That's really the hallmark of a great entrepreneur. They're dogged. Yeah, absolutely. So they, what they know. They know because our success stories are pretty valid. And sometimes we don't make the connection fast enough, but generally it's a networked economy. Everyone knows what's going on. Information is absolutely a commodity these days. And people know whether if you're an interesting entrepreneur, they want to have that connection.
Okay. So there was a question there.
Thank you. Hi. You just spoke about motivation, and I was thinking, how do you see the future in green companies that have a charitable edge or look out for ecology?
Sure, yeah.
Do you think,
How do I see them?
Yeah, is that a plus? Is that where companies should go? Have an edge to that?
I think that's going to be, again, one of these must-haves in any corporation. I mean, even in young businesses like the ones we back, which are so small and they've got everything to figure out. We're already talking about things like corporate social responsibility and environmental policies and sort of, you'd be amazed, the anti-corruption things. I mean, things that you think of when you're on a board of a public company, because clearly you have governance and regulation, but at a young stage, a good entrepreneur, once they're at the business is sort of, there's a sort of steady business, and they're not fighting 100 fights, but they're only fighting 20 fights every day, because that's what it is. They start thinking about these things. So to me, it's no longer a differentiating factor, the fact that you're potentially kind of eco-friendly. If you talk about businesses that their only premise is to be, kind of next generation green, if you will. We actually made a conscious decision not to invest in some of the solar businesses, etc., because we saw them more as infrastructure businesses where you have to invest hundreds of millions of capital. There was manufacturing involved. Not that manufacturing is not a bad thing, but it's not necessarily a place where venture capital money makes a return. And so we decided not to invest in that because you really had to sink a lot of money before you even had a prototype that worked. So I think for the more infrastructure and the more manufacturing end of those businesses, we certainly have stayed away. And by the way, upon reflection, it looks like the smartest move. We didn't think it was that smart at the time, and a lot of investors asked us. But in terms of just kind of being eco-friendly and being environmentally sustainable and in general kind of social responsibility, I think that's become part and parcel of any business that has a chance of staying alive or even going public.
And last question, I'm sorry, you said something about a book and women entrepreneurship, and I didn't understand. Could you repeat that, please?
No, there's just a book, Athena Doctrine. I don't know if you've read it.
Can we just provide for the DLD team for your Facebook page of IBC that author and the title, and then you can read it.
He spoke at DLD today, and it's just a fabulous insight into what countries and entrepreneurs and companies have done around leadership, and how it's not about male and women, but it's about sort of female traits, and how female traits are becoming more and more relevant in the sort of political and economic uncertainty that we face. So that was it.
Question here, sorry, first.
So speaking about the traits, are there any specific traits an entrepreneur has to have besides attracting talents and being motivated, but really personal skills that are essential as an entrepreneur?
Yes, I mean, I think that the attracting talent is more an outcome than a trait. I think the trait that I have seen is really around, it's really a lot of self-confidence, because you get so many knocks as an entrepreneur, and it's not easy because, do you tell your board the absolute truth? No. You don't tell your investors how tough it is sometimes. I mean, of course you all know, but you always try to keep a brave face. You try to inspire your team. If you have a husband or a wife, you come home and then you kind of have to sort of keep up the good act. So I think it's a very lonely place to be, very rewarding, very tough, but you have to be very, very strong. There has to be an inner core of self-confidence, which is not arrogance, by the way, but it's true belief, it's true passion. It is optimism, but in good doses of reality. But it's really about inner strength that I've seen, which is the things that great entrepreneurs and the best entrepreneurs have gone through, some of the toughest journeys, right? It's never all as, no matter what you read, it's never as good as, look at the just read Steve Jobs, and I know, and he's not just one.
It takes tons of energies.
Yeah, it's a very special place to be, but by God, if you know you have it in you, or if you think you may have it, you owe it to yourselves to try, because that's how you make an impact on the world and on yourself, I think.
So a question right here.
Just recently, ACCEL announced a deal in Kleiderkreisel, and I was wondering, so now marketplaces are not necessarily new, and e-commerce and especially fashion are like kind of very marketing intense industries. So I would figure that. So what exactly makes you believe that like this kind of new business model, let's call it that way, will succeed? And there are like many other competitors also having been funded by VCs. So what do you do and what can you do to make your bet succeed compared to others?
Yeah, so listen, we have, cumulatively, as I said, we have hundreds of companies. So I think it's tough to talk about, if you bear with me, it's tough to talk about an individual one because so many things go into an investment decision. But in that particular case, what I will point out is that the concept of sharing sharing everything as part of your life, the sort of collaborative culture to the nth degree, and doing it in a way that's truly viral and organic. And what I mean by that, a lot of the companies that you're referring to spend a lot of money acquiring a consumer, marketing to them, finding out how to retain them, and reacquiring them again. What we saw with this company was absolute meteoric growth and real engagement to the extent that was not there in any commerce before. So it was really a phenomenal mix of social and commerce that people talk about that you don't often see, and we'd seen enough. Back to the pattern recognition, we'd seen so many companies and so many projects and products that aspired to have that link where it was as much about really a community as opposed to about commerce, and this company had managed to do that, and we thought it was enabling new forms of behavior that people kind of really didn't really think they would be part of. And they were doing it in more than one geography. So when we see that kind of growth, we see new forms of behavior, we see that level of engagement, we sit up and we think, well, is it a business? And the answer we say is maybe, maybe not, but in this case we clearly thought it was.
Straight to you. You have the mic. So, you handed the mic, sir. Any further question? Questions? There's a hand.
Stefan is running out of questions, so please help him.
I have enough.
Perfect. Yeah. So first of all, thank you a lot for a very inspiring talk, especially for women becoming entrepreneurs. So I'm a female entrepreneur myself.
Okay.
I founded a platform for scuba divers.
Oh, wow.
Which is called divingspecialist.com. Check it out. And,
I'm scared of scuba diving.
My question to you is, you have seen so many businesses. Have you ever thought of becoming an entrepreneur yourself? And if so, what kind of area would you focus on?
Tough question. I was telling Stefan about my journey. Where I grew up in India, and I left in the late 80s when India was not a place with a lot of economic opportunity. A few channels, one brand of toothpaste. The company had not opened up to foreign investment. So either you were going to join a family business, which I was unfortunately didn't have, or you're going to be a doctor. And I really didn't sort of fancy cutting up people. I didn't think I had any talent of that. Or you were maybe going to be a chartered accountant, and I'm not exaggerating. This was the only thing you were brought up to be. Either you're going to get married or you were going to be chartered accountant or a doctor. None of that was working for me, so I figured I better get out. And so I got myself to the US. The great thing is I got myself to the US. I wouldn't be sitting here or having got my kids or having my life that I have currently. But the bad thing is I was always an immigrant with a visa, with a lot of debt to pay back. So actually, I encourage entrepreneurship because I believe it's entirely possible, but I never had anyone telling me this. And so I never took that extra risk, which I already had so much risk about being an immigrant and all the other things I've just talked about. But I wish I had thought about it. I think it's a little late now because this is all I know how to do. I'd be a useless entrepreneur. But at the right time, I'm sure, it was the right journey to have taken. But after 15 years of doing this, I think it is a little bit too late. And in terms of what I would be doing, I think probably in some of these areas that I've talked about where it's truly about enabling something that never existed before. And I've always had a fascination for microlending and for Grameen Bank and for kind of the stories that you heard about the Gates Foundation and what they're doing and how you sort of combine social and finance to really bring about change globally. I mean, that's fascinating. I'm not sure that's a great business plan in the short term, but I think fascinating. So anyway, great question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, then the final question. If you have to give one recommendation to the students here, would you say, this is the most important recommendation I have to give you for your further life? Which one would that be?
I would say what I've been saying, which is, I think what I understand, this is a fabulous university. I feel privileged to be sitting here, and each of you has many, many, many job opportunities. And I'm sure that there are a lot of good reasons to go to the established German companies that are global leaders, whether it's BMW or Porsche or Siemens, Audi, there's a lot of them, huh? But I would say take a risk. Take a risk, try to go into technology where you really are given responsibility that you never dreamed of. Just because these companies are so young and they're so disruptive that they have to give young people opportunity, and it's only when you're on the hot seat. What's the expression? You put a tea bag and you put somebody into a tea bag and then you really know what they do when they're in hot water. So only when you're on a hot seat do you really learn what you're capable of. And so my only encouragement would be take that risk, take the risk now when, frankly, you're young, and experiment with other areas because you can get any job you want, and don't just go into where the last generation or the many generations, I hope you're not going to be angry for me for saying this, the jobs they've taken in the big German companies. So, and I would say, think it's incredible that English is the curriculum here, and maybe it's obvious now after so many years, but I think that's fascinating. It's not where the rest of Europe has followed, and I think go abroad, think international, think about how things are done differently, and you can always come back.
Sonali, thank you very much.
Pleasure. Thank you.